Hello and good afternoon, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here for this tremendously interesting event today. My name is James Kneebone. I'm part of the Gas, Hydrogen and Decarbonization team at the Florence School of Regulation. I'm filling in today for Andres Peebags, who is our real leading man on methane. However, he was unfortunately needed elsewhere for a parallel event today. Nevertheless, we hope he joins us for the second half. You'll also have to forgive me for my slightly muffled voice. I'm suffering with tonsillitis at the moment, so hopefully it shouldn't be a problem, as we have several really well-informed panelists who can do most of the talking for me today. So I will introduce them in a bit in detail, but just briefly so we're all acquainted. We have with us today Dr. Andrea Kalkan and Dr. Cynthia Randles of the United Nations Environmental Programme. We have Mr. Casey Michaels of the International Energy Agency and Dr. Tibor Stelbakshi from the European External Action Service. So today's event is on the Methane Alert and Response System, aka MARS. As the name suggests, this is a system that identifies particularly large methane emission hotspots and notifies the relevant parties in an effort to bring visibility and accountability. Operationally speaking, the MARS mechanism uses satellite data to identify methane hotspots, and then the International Methane Emissions Observatory, or IMEO, you'll be hearing a lot of acronyms today, which is housed within the United Nations Environmental Programme, or UNEP, communicates this information to those who are responsible, as well as the relevant government agencies. So at the moment, this tool is focused on the energy sector, which is logical, as that is where you are more likely to see these sort of anomalous extreme emission events. Think about ruptures in gas pipelines or persistent venting, for example. The single most significant recorded methane emission release last year was the Nord Stream explosions in September, releasing roughly 500,000 tons of methane over the course of just a few days. But in fact, just these large individual events are responsible for an estimated 10% of anthropogenic methane emissions, and as such, represent the low-hanging fruit of emission avoidance. That being said, the emissions from Nord Stream, although massive, were equivalent to the typical daily emissions of the oil and gas sector. And as such, with time and additional resources, MARS is going to expand its scope to progressively smaller emission sources, also covering the waste and agriculture sectors. MARS is a perfect example of international collaboration on methane and part of a wider stepped-up efforts from the international community to get a handle on this greenhouse gas, following the voluntary commitments made on the methane pledge at COP26, which targets 30% reduction in anthropogenic methane emissions by 2030 relative to 2020 levels. At the moment, emissions are actually increasing, so clearly there is a lot of work to do here and considerable pressure on this MARS tool to deliver. Although I would also postulate that due to the poor data on methane in general, the numbers on emissions from 2020 were probably underestimated, and with improving data quality, we'll be adding more and more emissions to the accounts, only making the task more challenging. That being said, there's clearly a significant appetite. Michael Regan, the administrator for the Environmental Protection Agency in the US, has been quoted in the Financial Times today, really giving his support and his weight behind efforts to crack down on methane emissions in the oil and gas sector. So there's clearly a big political momentum. That's probably enough background on the event itself, and I'll pass over now to our first speaker. And just to remind everyone, please put your questions in the Q&A box and at any time, and we will get to them during our Q&A session later. So without further ado, let me introduce Dr. Andrea Kalkan, who is a Program Management Officer at UNEP. She coordinates IMEO's methane science studies. She's a Romanian senior scientist with expertise in atmospheric airborne research activities. And prior to joining UNEP, Andrea managed a research team and coordinated international research projects, focusing mainly on cloud physics, satellite calibration, and validation campaigns, as well as airborne research. Andrea holds a PhD and an MSc from the University of Bucharest, and Dr. Kalkan is going to give us her analysis of the Nord Stream incident specifically. So over to you.
Thank you very much for the invitation. So, and for the nice introduction. So now I can use all the acronyms properly because you introduced them really well. So, not losing time, I will talk a little bit of what my work as a scientist within UNEP is about. And it's all about methane. And the United Nations Environmental Programme launched IMEO, which stands for the International Methane Emissions Observatory, as an independent entity to help solve the methane problem in the atmosphere. And this doing it with interconnecting data with actions on research, reporting, and implementations. And all this serves to help the community, the world, if you want, to reduce methane by 2030. And how do we do it? Everything is around data. In order to take in place regulations, in order to force anyone to do things or help companies to reduce their emissions and in daily life, we need to understand what we need to do. And for that, we need reliable data and quality data, not only just pure data that we just take from everywhere. So how do we do it? First of all, we have a science component which targets to fill these knowledge gaps and to help us locate where the emissions are, how they happen, and when they happen. And all this is done via dedicated methane science studies. Then we go further and work with a transparency component that we call, and we work with the industry to make them understand, help us to do the transparent reporting, but also we help them to conduct actions. So this is done under the Oil and Gas Methane Partnerships 2.0 and also under the Met-Coal Methane Partnership. So we target not only oil and gas sector, but also the metallurgical coal sector. And then, of course, we combine this with the methane alert and response system. Going further, we need to help institutions, we need to help policymakers, governments to take this data and use it properly and efficiently. So we do that under our implementation component, which raise awareness and increase the capacity of governments and companies and entities. And we really train them and teach them and make them understand why methane matters and why climate change matters.
Sorry, Andrea, to interrupt you, but we still only see the first slide, the opening slide. I don't know if that's deliberate, but...
No. Okay, maybe I stop sharing. Do you see anything?
Yeah, we see the slide deck, but it's on the opening title slide. It's not in presentation mode.
For that, for me, it was moving.
Perhaps it is just me, but
Cynthia, would you like me to try and share your set? If you
no, maybe I like this. I just share my screen if it's easier.
Yeah, sure. That's not bad at all.
Oh, actually not that good.
Swapping displays, maybe.
Yeah, maybe can you try it? Sorry for that.
Sorry, you mean you would like me to do it?
Do you see it now?
Yeah, this
Yes.
is good.
Fine.
Yep, that's perfect.
Okay, so the way how we collect data is revolutionary. So we collect data, as I said, from the OGMP companies. We put together data from the science measurement studies. We look into inventory data and we combine this with satellite data. We apply machine learning, artificial intelligence, modeling, simulations on this data. And then we try to reconcile inconsistency and identify gaps that we further address. And with all this, we build up a full methane emissions database that we further use for annual reporting and do science-based implementation support. So just to give you a sense of OGMP, what the Oil and Gas Methane Partnership means in coverage. So here you have a map of over 60 countries, nearly 100 companies already joined in this initiative. And we cover with that over 35% of the global oil and gas production. You need to know that OGMP is the only comprehensive measurement-based reporting framework for oil and gas industry. And as I mentioned before, we try to build up on this know-how and extend it to the metallurgical coal, but also maybe, we don't know, maybe for waste, this will be also a good opportunity to learn out of this experience. And just to give you a sense of the methane science studies, what we cover, so we target oil and gas sector, waste, and here you have in the map a little bit of extent of studies where they were conducted. Many more are coming. You need to understand that all the studies are led by independent academic institutions, and it always integrates a multiple measurement methodologies and technologies. So it's not just one single instrument or single technology-based study. And just to give you a sense of what we've done, so here is the Nord Stream analysis that we performed. And I need to mention here, it's not only UNEP doing that. UNEP was, in this case, conducting one part of measurements, and I will show you a little bit on that. But we put together, if you want, on the same table, all the scientists all over the world that were conducting when the Nord Stream event happened. We were putting together everyone on the table and tried to understand and analyze the event properly. So the event happened on the 26th of September, when first seismometers reported that the pressure was dropping in the pipelines, and we got first satellite images of the surface turbulence, so it was clear there is something coming up out of the pipeline close area. Then the Danish military next day provided a video of the surface turbulence, which was extending up to 1 kilometer in diameter. And the event was officially closed or declared closed on the 1st of October, when the Danish Energy Ministry agencies reported that the pressure was stabilizing in the pipeline. This doesn't mean that there is no methane coming out anymore, just that the pressure was stabilized, and from their point of view, the event was closed. Now, going into detail, who was measuring what? First measurements were reported by the towers, the ICOS, so the integrated carbon observation system, that had 3 stations around the locations or close by to the event location. And they measure basically continuous methane concentrations. Then first satellite data appeared. This satellite data, you need to be aware that there were few measurements because of cloudiness. So not always having a satellite around is easy to use data, and especially being over water, the event was difficult to characterize from satellites. But still, we have some information. For example, here is a analysis of IMEO's science team on Landsat-8 data. Then you have GHGSat data and Sentinel-2B measurements. Afterwards, IMEO managed to send the first team on site, if you want, with a helicopter measuring, but this was only on the 5th of October. So after officially the event was closed, but I will show you the results, which are really, really interesting. And then we combine this analysis with engineering calculations. So just to estimate what the pipeline was, volume was at that moment, what gas was in the pipelines. And we tried to put all this data together and understand what happened. And here it is. So you see with the different dashed lines and colors, all the measurements that were taken by different teams. This values show combinations of satellite with modeling, with engineering calculations, pure tower measurements, or pure satellite measurements. So you see the span of this data. Now, which one is the right one for every day? It's difficult to estimate and difficult to say, but we can clearly see that this event was emitting huge amounts of methane. Below you see the small satellite points and the aerial estimate. And if you look here in the zoom in, the first on the right-hand side, so on the right-hand side, you see this aerial measurement that the helicopter instrument was taking. And in the left-hand part, the satellite, the GHG-SAT data points. So it's a huge difference between what satellite were seeing and what towers and engineering calculations were estimating. Now, the first conclusion that we can draw out of this, just putting together all the data, it's that, first of all, a plausible range of total emission would be between 75,000 and 230,000 metric tons of methane. Then, the largest CH4 emission rate ever measured was recorded during 26th and the 1st of October, 26th of September and 1st of October. So this is the largest event ever measured in our times. So we need to be careful not to have this kind of events repeated. And as you mentioned in the introduction, so this is equivalent to 1 day of global oil and gas industry emission. And I think this has to be highlighted because we really need to solve this. And then not all the measurements are, like a silver bullet and straightforward. So we need to find a way to understand all these emissions. And just to give you a sense of how complicated it can be, I mentioned we flew with an aircraft, with a helicopter in the area. And here you see how this looks like. So we have here the team that was planning to do their own ground. And when they started planning flying, they usually fly upwind and downwind like a box, if you would imagine, around the area source, so the point source, because we thought it's a point source. So we flew, we had the aircraft flying around, the helicopter flying around. And during these flights, they realized that methane is enhanced upwind of the leak. So it was actually not a point source, but it was an area emitting. And this happened because the methane remaining and going out of the pipeline was dissolved in the ocean, and the currents of the ocean were driving the methane around. So you see here in the simulation how the methane was dissolving and moving around the pipeline source. And then it was diffused into the atmosphere. So just to get a sense how this looks like, this is on the 5th of October, the area that was emitting. Still, this area was emitting, estimated now, because this is still preliminary results, we estimated it was emitting tens of tons of CH4 per hour. So this is equivalent, or if you want to compare it with the highest emitter hotspot in Europe, the Upper Silesian Coal Basin, this emits approximately 50 tons per hour of methane. So we can say it's close by, considering all the error bars. So it was significant emitting also even after the event was stopped 5 days afterwards. And we expect that it was still continuing several days afterwards. So our first conclusions, because I have to mention that we are currently working with a huge group. I think there are over 30 scientists all over the world that now work together to put in place a scientific publication analyzing all this data that we have gathered together from all over the world on this event. So the first main thing to highlight here as a conclusion, preliminary conclusion, would be that this was the largest measured emission rate in 1 day. And this is covering for 1 day of global oil and gas industry emissions. So we need to understand the extent of the rest of emissions, the other 300 days of the year. Satellites have problems, and we're struggling to analyze the data due to cloudiness, due to water surface and dissolved methane. This prevented them to quantify efficiently the data. Towers can be really helpful to quantify most of the emissions. And yes, we are happy to say that we successfully sampled methane emitted from the vicinity of the Nord Stream leak. And yeah, as I said, it was in the tens of tons, but still in the tens of kilograms per hour, but it was not higher than the larger European emission hotspot. And with that, I would thank you and happy to take any questions.
Amazing. Many thanks, Dr. Kalkin. That was super interesting, fascinating the way you presented the data as well. So I think you're allowing us to share those slides after the event. So I think that would be a really good resource for our audience to go back through. I know I will. There's some really interesting data there. Again, I would encourage our audience to put any questions they might have in the Q&A box, and we'll circle back to them at the end after all the presentations. So it's now my pleasure to bring to the floor Dr. Cynthia Randles, the Program Manager for the Mars System and an advisor for IMEO on the National Methane Emissions Inventories. Prior to joining UNEP, Cynthia was a climate researcher at ExxonMobil Research and Engineering Company. During her tenure at Exxon, Cynthia served as a lead author and contributing author for the IPCC Task Force for Inventories. And she also has research experience on climate modeling, global aerosol modeling, and constituent data assimilation at NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center and Modeling Assimilation Office. So she holds a PhD in atmospheric and ocean sciences from Princeton University, and she's going to give us a presentation on satellite systems for emissions detection, as well as the Mars system specifically. So over to you. I think you're muted still, Cynthia. Your mic, yeah, there you go.
It's too many screens, apologies.
It's okay, you're unmuted now, so we can hear you.
Okay, now you can see the screen properly?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, thank you. So today I wanted to give you a brief overview of the Mars system. Mars, the Methane Alert and Response System, is the first global system that connects satellite measurements of detected methane to transparent notification processes that promote on-the-ground mitigation efforts. So Mars was designed to contribute to IMEO's overall mission of providing open, reliable, and actionable data to stakeholders who have the agency to act on emissions. Mars harnesses state-of-the-art satellite data to quickly identify major emissions events, notify and engage stakeholders, including countries and operators, and provide support for mitigation and track progress through time. Recognizing the current state-of-the-art with satellites technology, Mars is first focused on the energy sector, where we will identify emissions from oil, gas, and coal activities, with the ambition of expanding into other sectors, namely waste and agriculture in time. Right now, Mars consists of 4 components, which I'm showing you here in summary on this slide. The first component has to do with detection and attribution, where we're using the satellites to identify the emissions events and working to link them to specific sources or facilities and the operators that own those facilities. Then in component 2, we notify relevant stakeholders of the information that we've gathered. And this includes companies and governments, and let them know about the information that we have, including location of events and possible sources. At the same time, we ask for feedback from them to gain more information about what's going on the ground. Following the notification process in component 3, stakeholders are expected to take action. Through Mars, IMEO will provide information and connections to relevant stakeholders to support them in their mitigation efforts. And finally, In component 4, we will use this data and document it within the Mars system. This data we will document includes satellite data and feedback from the operators and governments. We'll also seek feedback from operators, governments, and other stakeholders regarding the system performance so that we can improve it over time. So first, I want to dive a little bit into component 1 and talk a little bit about satellite detection of methane. We've discussed some of the limitations of it in Andrea's talk. However, it does provide us one of the best opportunities to view what's going on with methane at a global scale. So as you know, there's already a large number of satellites in orbit measuring methane, which I show here in this graphic from a paper from Daniel Jacobs. In this graphic, you see a top arc and a bottom arc. The top arc represents satellites that are known as global mapping satellites, and these typically have coarser resolution, but more often daily coverage of the Earth. And the bottom arc are high resolution satellites. These satellites can have pixel sizes on the order of 30 meters, and so can resolve methane down to the facility level, but they typically don't see the whole Earth very often. And in some cases, you actually have to point them to go look at a position on the Earth that you're interested in looking at. Most of these data sets are publicly available from national space agencies, although increasingly there are a number of private sector satellites capable of measuring methane. With Mars, our approach is to first use the global mappers or area flux mappers to identify very large methane plumes, which are usually on the order of 10,000 kilograms per hour or more, or hotspots, where these are regions where methane concentrations have been enhanced over long periods of time. So the satellites in blue are the current global mappers that we're using. Tropomi is the main one, and MethaneSat will be coming online next year. And then after we've identified spots of interest from these global mappers, we then zoom in with the high resolution satellites so that we can actually attribute those emissions to particular sources down to the facility level. Through this whole process, we are working with our partners, both at the SRON, Netherlands Institute for Space Research, and Kairos Inc. to implement the satellite component. This here is an example of a high resolution satellite detections from OSI, the Italian PRISMA instrument, and the ESA's Sentinel-2 instrument. Excuse me. As you can see, by comparing the satellite data to visual imagery, as well as using databases of infrastructure and ownership, such as we have from OGMP 2.0, Mars is able to connect the emissions to facilities and then the facilities to operators. With this attribution information in hand, we can then enter into component 2, notification. So we use a two-step notification process in Mars to inform relevant stakeholders about emissions. The first is an initial notification, and this happens as quickly as possible after an emission is detected. If Mars has detected an emission and attributed it to a OGMP 2.0 company member for whom we have information, the relevant contact information, UNEP will notify both the company and the company simultaneously. If, however, we don't have the relevant company contact, we will inform the government for which the emission is occurring and ask them to help us obtain that contact information for the operator. We then request that notified parties quickly acknowledge our notification and provide any initial feedback they might have, such as if they knew the emissions were from a known event, such as an operation that was ongoing. Meanwhile, we will work to gather more information from high-resolution satellites. This data will enable the system to attribute the emission to the facility level. Excuse me. And provide further estimates of emission rates as viewed by the satellite. Then, after about 2 weeks, for our final notification, Mars will provide a detailed report of all the findings that we have from the satellite data. We will then further request the operators provide us additional feedback regarding the root cause of the emission and share any mitigation plans completed or in process within 45 to 75 days post-notification. This information will then be documented within the Mars system. Throughout this process, Mars will work with our partners, including connecting stakeholders with mitigation support where possible. In particular, we're designing and developing Mars in collaboration with the International Energy Agency, who you'll hear from later, and the Climate and Clean Air Coalition. As part of IMEO, the goal of Mars is to promote global transparency, so to help countries achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement. To that end, our goal is not to point fingers, but rather to serve as a platform through which the community can cooperate and identify and address the biggest sources of methane emissions globally. This is why we encourage active participation in the Mars process. This will enable stakeholders to publicly demonstrate and their commitment to best-in-class operations. So our data policy thus is within 45 to 75 days post-detection, the information we publicize will include all IMEO gathered satellite data, including methane and visual data and any related non-proprietary metadata. A summary of the company and or country responses to the notification process, such as if they responded to IMEO or not, or if they had a sense of what the emissions were, if they were from a known operation, etc. We will also publicize a summary description of any mitigation plans or efforts in process. Furthermore, we'll continue to monitor the site and note any future detections linked to that location or facility. So just to give you a sense of the timeline of Mars, UNEP launched Mars at COP27 to support countries to reduce their methane emissions, particularly in pursuit of the global methane pledge. We began our pilot phase at the beginning of this year, and we're currently working with partners to test different aspects of Mars and identify the right context for notification and mitigation. During this first 6 months, we are not publicizing any data. In the second half of the year, starting July 1st, Mars will become fully operational and data will be made publicly available within 45 to 75 days post-detection. Mars is designed to continually evolve with the observing system. So as new satellites come along, their data will be integrated into Mars in the Mars processes. This will enable Mars to identify events at lower and lower detection emission levels, as well as eventually incorporate other sectors such as waste and agriculture as the technology improves. So thanks again for your attention, and I'm happy to take questions at the end of the session.
Amazing. Thank you, Cynthia. Again, really clear slides and something about this satellite subject that makes it, I don't know, much more engaging and interesting as a subject, I think, because you have these great visual products. I mean, methane, we can't see it, right, with the naked eye. So being able to have these satellite images really helps to give some kind of more like tactile dimension to the subject. So thank you for sharing that. Now we'll move on to our final presenter. So this is Casey Michaels, who is a legal advisor at the IEA and a key person behind IEA's methane initiatives in general. Prior to coming to the IEA, Casey worked at the US Department of Energy, supporting the development of innovative technologies in the energy sector. He holds a degree in law from New York University and a degree in environmental politics and policy from the University of Maryland. So over to you, Casey. And apologies, we're a little bit pressed for time now. So if you could do your best to keep within the minutes, I'd appreciate it. Thanks. We lost you for a minute there, but you want to try again?
Not sure what happened. Can you all see the screen and hear me okay?
Yep, all good.
All right, I'll try to be quick. Thanks, everyone. But before, I just want to start with very briefly to introduce a few of the key conclusions from the IEA's 2023 Global Methane Tracker, which we released last month. The tracker is a tool that provides our best estimates on a global level of where methane emissions are based on the latest science studies, measurements, satellite data. Really, the overall picture is that from 2022, we did not see major progress. Essentially, emissions are flat. The emissions intensity is still far too high and not falling fast enough. So despite some positive signs of progress, we estimate that energy-related methane emissions rose in 2022, given the large general increases in fossil fuel production. And this increase is perhaps all the more surprising because of the record gas prices we saw in 2022, alongside the serious security of supply concerns and economic uncertainty. So there was a lot kind of going on last year, but the overall picture on methane is largely the same as in previous years. Our global methane tracker draws heavily on the insights and findings from on-the-ground measurement campaigns, as well as from satellites. So this image here comes from Kairos, who's also contributing to the Mars program. And overall, we really, just as Cynthia has already described, we've seen massive improvements in satellites for detecting and quantifying emissions over the past few years. They've really provided a huge boost to our understanding of the level and nature of methane emissions, especially for the largest leaks. And of course, this is a very fast moving and evolving field. During 2022, the number of countries where we were able to take measurements has increased. So last year, there were around 70 countries where very large leaks from oil and gas operations could be detected could possibly be detected for at least 15 days. And there were 20 countries where these leaks were actually observed. So this is really quite significant. There were also 7 countries where satellite emissions were detected from coal events. So really, the number of places where this is becoming a useful tool is increasing year by year. And with new satellites coming online, that's only poised to increase. Fortunately, there are a whole array of different options available to operators and to countries to bring down these emissions. Our latest assessment from the Global Methane Tracker is that we could cut methane from oil and gas operations by around 3/4 using existing technologies that are already being deployed and utilized kind of around the world. And based on price levels seen in recent years, around half of these measures could be deployed at no net cost. Because methane is the main component of natural gas, and if you avoid emissions of methane, it's often possible to sell it. This can bring an overall profit when you can resell captured gas. But critically, in 2022, we had much, much higher prices than normal. And at the prices seen in different regions around the world, the vast majority of options to reduce methane emissions could have been implemented at no net cost. Yet, because methane is such a potent greenhouse gas, no matter what the gas price is, or even if the gas has no value at all, tackling methane emissions is one of the most cost-effective ways to limit near-term global warming. And if we look just for a moment at what governments can do, we've seen there are already a number of policy and regulatory strategies available that can bring down emissions substantially. In oil and gas, these include policies like mandating the adoption of certain technologies, low-emitting technologies and equipment, requiring leak detection and repair programs, and requirements to limit or stop flaring and venting. For coal, the most important reductions will come from reductions in coal consumption and use. But for the coal that continues to be mined, while still a relatively new area for policymakers, there are emerging strategies that can encourage companies to reduce emissions. And together, if governments take all available policy options, this could potentially lead to emissions being reduced by 70%. And the last 2 years have really been landmark years for new methane policies. At the international level, momentum behind the Global Methane Pledge continues to grow, with over 150 countries now. Over 50 of those countries have already released national action plans or begun working on them. New regulations are being implemented around the world, in Colombia and Nigeria in 2022, as well as new actions in the US and proposed actions in the US and in the EU. And there's also many voluntary initiatives at the industry level as well. But really, now is the time for much more on-the-ground action and to convert these large policy initiatives into real deployment. For our part, the IEA is working closely with IMEO and UNEP to support the mission of not only bringing transparency to man-made methane emissions, but also working with countries and with operators to bring those emissions down. Over the past couple of years, our efforts have included developing a number of different tools that can contribute to this effort. Primary one being our global methane tracker, which I've already mentioned. In addition, we have also developed a set of regulatory roadmaps. These are publications for policymakers and regulators trying to bring down emissions with new regulations or policies. They both include materials on strategies to immediately reduce emissions and also on improving emissions data and how to improve our understanding of emissions. Our guide on coal mine methane emissions was released last month, with the oil and gas one having been released in 2021. And finally, we've also been working with companies and operators through initiatives like the Methane Guiding Principles. And last year, we released a oil and gas sector toolkit for the Global Methane Pledge, which is hosted on the MGP website. And looking ahead, I just want to say that we'll also be working very closely with IMEO and with the Mars team as we kind of bring this project really into full action and scale it up. We've already been working with IMEO to provide input on the initial design of Mars, and we'll continue to work together on implementation. Once we start to reach the real operational stage, we will be, from IEA's standpoint, mostly involved in component 2, where we will be helping to bring Mars to the attention of regulators and policymakers around the world, and assist those countries in developing and operating a system to receive those alerts, and then also to start to take action and notify the operators and start to really address the issues after a leak is detected. So in this regard, we'll also be involved in the components 3 and 4, and will be available to work with countries and operators to collectively learn from these events and implement new strategies, whether those be technical strategies on the ground or policy strategies that are put in place by governments and regulators. Hopefully, all together, we can use these kinds of actions to bring down emissions. And that's my last slide. So happy to take any questions. Thanks.
Super. Thank you, Casey. Very interesting to hear this policy dimension. I think it sort of completes the picture for us. Also, the economic aspect. And although initially, as you say, the emissions are either flat or perhaps even increasing, with this sort of head of steam in the data collection and dissemination, as well as this sort of growth in policy initiatives that you mentioned, perhaps we'll see, closer to 2030, some big sort of step changes in emissions as those start to take effect. Let's hope. That very interesting picture painted. So thank you very much for that. We're now coming into the Q&A section. So again, I encourage anyone who has a question to post it in the Q&A. We'll have to be a little bit briefer than planned, I think, just to keep relatively within time. And I'm going to kick it off with a question we already received prior to the event, and I see that the gentleman interested in asking this question is also in the call, so that's perfect. Mr. Toby McIntosh had some sort of procedural and transparency questions, and he was asking why we might delay emission data publication during contacts with the emitter, what level of emissions would likely to be triggering action under these mechanisms, and will the communication with the emitter be publicly available? So I think this is a question for Cynthia. So if you're happy to take this one, then we'll start there. Thanks.
Sure. I think I noted on one of my slides, we have certain contractual obligations with some of the data that prevent us from releasing it prior to the 45-day mark. In addition, we need some internal time for quality assurance from a scientific perspective, and that's the reason for the delay. The second question, can you remind me of that one, please?
Yes, so the second question is what level of emissions will trigger action? So I guess it's on the tolerances.
So that relates really to the detection limits of the satellites that we have. So currently, if we start with a global mapping satellite like TROPOMI, that typically detects on the order of 10,000 kilograms per hour or more. If we move down to the high resolution satellites, we can get better detection limits on the order of maybe 1,000 to 10,000 kilograms per hour, depending on the satellite. But generally, we'll be starting from the TROPOMI data as our first sort of initial target. We use that to target the other satellites. So generally, you're looking at higher level emitters, unless it's in a region of elevated methane concentration, which we call a hotspot. then we might be looking at more like 1,000 kilograms per hour or so would trigger us to go and look with the high resolution satellites.
Okay, super. Thanks very much. I think that was well covered. So, Toby, if you have any follow-up question, again, please feel free to drop it in the chat or in the Q&A. Otherwise, we'll move on to the question we have in the Q&A from Mr. John Howlett, who asks, are there plans to develop an API so that companies can pull data rather than waiting to be contacted in 1 to 3 days? The sooner companies know of an event, the quicker they can stop it. So I would like to come to Andrea for this one. Perhaps also Cynthia can complement as you see fit.
Yes, so I think at this stage of Mars, there is no plan for that. We should certainly consider it. I think it's a good idea that the information goes fast enough to the companies out. But as Cynthia mentioned, when we send out an information, we also want to be 100% sure what we send out. So don't, make a big alert around the thing that afterwards we just understand maybe it was, not that high emitting in the end. I don't know, maybe Cynthia's is different, but I think it's a good idea and good suggestion for the future development of Mars. But I would say now let's keep it running and have it in this way implemented and then make it better.
Yeah, for any new detection, we have this holding period, like I mentioned, for contractual regions with the data provider. So we simply cannot make it available through an API in that sense. But we do work to reduce the time that we contact operators. One way an operator can reduce the time in which they receive a notification for us is to join OGMP 2.0 and provide us the proper contact information through that. In that way, we skip the step of having to ask governments for contact information of companies. So we encourage all companies to join OGMP 2.0 for many reasons, but also to reduce the time that it takes Mars to notify you.
Okay, super. Thanks very much. And if there are no more questions in the Q&A, oh no, I see there is a second one. Okay, Toby has a sort of short follow-up question where he asks, can you estimate how many events will be triggered based on the parameters you just explained? Is that within your sort of technical capacity?
I can say, generally speaking, within a month, we can see on the order of 40 or 50 detections from tropomy of large plumes.
Okay.
That's just a rough guess, but give you a sense. But then we also, like I said, we also work off of this concept of hotspots, which are determined from averages of tropomy data over long periods of time. And there's, maybe like 100 hotspots around the world that we're currently investigating at different rates with the high resolution satellites. So that increases the number of events that we have within Mars.
Okay, super. Thanks very much. And if there's no more questions in the Q&A, I'd love to come to Casey with a quick question. I thought it was very interesting in your presentation that you remarked on the high gas prices of 2022 and how they'd not really encourage producers to address the methane leaks. I mean, personally, I'd thought at the time that given the tightness of the global market, particularly in Europe, it might have prompted suppliers to make leak prevention a real priority, for economic reasons, if nothing else. But although it's disappointing to see that that didn't happen, perhaps it shouldn't be a surprise, because even prior to the crisis, I think roughly 40% of emissions abatement in the oil and gas sector was at no net cost, according to the IEA's Methane Tracker. So if economics won't do it, do you think this sort of public accountability is the answer? And do you think it will make a significant impact, perhaps because it threatens the credibility of the sector, because there's this sort of more public dimension? How do you reflect on these different sort of levers for action?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I mean, when we think about this, there's a number of different reasons why we might imagine companies would not take action, even though it could potentially be cost effective. The biggest one is the information. I mean, and this is where the transparency really comes in. But in order to take advantage of that cost effective reduction, you have to know about the level of emissions. You have to know about the abatement opportunities, and you have to know what the price you will obtain is. So, I mean, there's a kind of a lot of information that is all needed together. In this last year, when there's a dramatic change in price, then that might have spurred some action by a number of companies to take action on this, some of which we have already might not be seen for a while, depending on what kinds of action they need to take. So that's just one kind of backdrop to that. But there's potentially other types of barriers. Flaring in particular, we noticed there was a big push, particularly from the consumers, from the European Union and from consumers in the EU and purchasers downstream, trying to push their suppliers to do better on flaring, because flaring, at least theoretically, could lead to an immediate influx of gas. And in some places, there is actually excess kind of capacity to take up gas that is not flared. But in other cases, there was limited capacity kind of for the flared gas to actually reach market. So some of these kind of infrastructure barriers that need to be dealt with and that may need to be thought of on a kind of policymaker, kind of a systemic or basin-wide level to ensure that that infrastructure is in place. But at least from our standpoint, this transparency is really important. More discussion about this, more emphasis on this will get companies in a better position to know where the emissions are and what their opportunities are. But in the end, it is going to require regulatory action in most countries to ensure that not just the good actors, not just those that are trying to get ahead of the issue, but all companies take this seriously and reduce their emissions as low as possible. And the one final thing I'd say is partly building off of the last question as well. This is such a fast-moving space, especially when we talk about satellites and on detection. And it's interesting, the question that we just had of how many detected events could be detected per month. If you'd asked us the same question like 2 or 3 years ago, that would have been a very different answer. So just to point out, when you ask us that question in 2 or 3 years from now, it could be a much higher number already.
Yeah, very true. Thank you so much for that. Now we're still going to come to Tibor for the last intervention and for the final 5 minutes of the session. So stick around for that. But I just wanted to pass the mic over to Andres, who should have been your moderator for today. He is the real methane expert at the FSR. If he wanted to say a couple of words in a minute or so.
Well, thank you, James, for giving me the floor. I think it is an extremely important issue. I also today talked on the EU-US regulatory bodies, and it's growing of importance. There is understanding also in industry about, but I appreciate all the work that is being done by experts, really trying to raise attention to it. It is a bit uphill struggle sometimes, I feel, but today's event definitely was the one that tries to encourage people to think about methane emissions seriously, to see the opportunities that it gives to climate change. And with this, I would pass to Tibor for concluding remarks, and thank you for all the speakers for joining, and thank you, James, for fantastic moderation.
Super, my pleasure. So yeah, without further ado, then it's my pleasure to introduce our final speaker, who is going to close the session. Tibor is a principal advisor on energy diplomacy at the European External Action Service, and before joining the EAS, Tibor served in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Hungary. Dr. Sterbacki has a master's in the science of economics and a PhD in international relations from Budapest University of Economic Sciences. So over to you, Tibor, and thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you very much for the invitation, and really thanks for all the presentations. I think it was extremely interesting and good to see that if there is a political will and there is a political measure or action, how it will be translated to reality and for everyday practice. And it was extremely interesting to see that how the political aim are supported by the state-of-the-art technology and creating a situation when really the quality data and the evidence can be a basis for any further actions. I fully agree what Mr. Pibak said, Andris, that the methane and the reduction of the methane is one of the top priority. We all know, I think it's not necessary in this circle to present it, that reducing global methane emission by 30% will reduce the global warming by 0.3 Celsius degree by 2050. So the global warming potential of methane is much more 80 times more than for the carbon dioxide. So this is really something what we have to prioritize and to do everything to achieve the goal. That's why the global methane pledge is an extremely important international tool to gather all the member states and to do this reduction. But of course, like with every initiative or every measure, the big question is really the walk the talk question. So really to do and to have results. And since last year was more to gather more participants for the subscribers for the global methane pledge, this year will definitely to move into implementation by the national action plans and for paving a way towards the 2030 targets. And for this, the Mars and the detection and for the satellite system, what was just presented very clearly, is an excellent tool to do this. So it's really a very good example when data, quality data, reliable data, and evidence drive a way how to deal with this issue. The question is, of course, the take and the use of the data and this notification and the engagement. I think we have to be honest to ourselves that it is an extremely positive issue and the transparency and very helpful tool, but it might be also in one or other cases a kind of really detection of something what maybe a company don't want to be detected or so. So this is a key question, how to communicate, how to formulate this tool. And I think this is our joint responsibility, and also for the EU, for member states, and for all participants of the global methane pledge, to communicate and present this as an opportunity, and a good tool really to detect if there is a methane leaking. And by side of the climate aim, there is a very clear security of supply aim from European point of view. So we know very well that last year more than 200 billion cubic meter gas was wasted simply worldwide by flaring, venting, and leaking. So if we can move into the direction that this take into account this no cost, no net cost part of the repairing the leakings and the wasting of the gas and catching the methane, this is something which is, I think, a real incentive for everybody, and for a real engine for meeting the objectives for 2030. So we are very much supporting this from the EU side, the whole initiative, also the what the Mars is doing, and all these exercises and developing the tool, and we remain very much supporting for this. This is which enable us to really to turn the global methane pledge into the implementation phase, and to have realistically really the aim to achieve the 30% decrease by 2030. So from the EU side, our support is there, and it will remain there, and we very much hope that we can present more and more good uses and effective use of the satellite system and the Mars in the field of the methane. Thank you very much once again for the invitation.
Thank you, Tibor. Thank you. I think that was the perfect way to end with this sort of rousing call. And it's just my pleasure to say really thank you to all of our speakers for joining today. We've been really fortunate to have all these experts with us in the same session. I think it's been a really, really rich session. And also, of course, a big thanks to our online team, to Chiara for making it possible. And of course, to our audience for tuning in to this installment of FSR Debate. So until next time, thank you very much to all, and see you soon. Ciao.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.